First up today is Susan Schubert, who has published 2 memoirs of trips to Europe. She's also won awards for poetry, short stories, and photography. One of her poems is on a mural in downtown Aurora, Illinois. Besides writing, Susan facilitates a writers group at another local library, sings in a rock and roll band, and cooks a mean Galway fish pie. She writes in her journal every day and specializes in poems about anything and everything. And she lives in the Fox Valley. Susan, come on up.
Okay, I'm going to start off with one of my favorite stories by John, A Couple of Mice. It was a beautiful Sunday in autumn with clear skies and temperatures in the 60s. Being late in the afternoon, the sun was low in the sky and casting long dark shadows. The wind was just a little gusty. Frank had climbed the narrow stairs up from the basement after spending hours tinkering at his workbench, lost in thought. Walking into the kitchen, he handed his grandson the little toy whose wheel he had just repaired. This immediately put a big smile on Billy's face as he looked up to say, "Thanks, Grandpa." After roughing the boy's hair a bit, he headed towards the back door. "I could use a little air and some rest for these very weary bones," he said to his family as he went out through the back door. His destination was the glider on his daughter's backyard deck. This was his favorite place to sit at this time of the day. It was a quiet time that gave him a chance to rest, but also to contemplate life and recollect. Since he retired last year, he had been cooped up in the house, fiddling around in his workshop. Here, predominantly displayed, could be found pictures of his late wife, taken during special occasions and in places they visited together. He missed and longed for her, but the pain in his heart just reminded him she would never return. His thought, the photographs, would be comforting, but sadly, they just became mundane. He mostly kept to himself, busy fixing grandkids' toys. But there were also plenty of other little projects around the house, like a squeaky door, a burnt-out light bulb, simple things to keep his mind busy and off the fact that he was alone and getting older. Where did the summer go, he thought to himself. It seems like only yesterday it was spring. I missed the whole summer. It's amazing how fast time flies when, Frank just sighed. Frank parked his old carcass down on the swing and pushed himself back and forth with his foot in a slow, relaxing manner. Looking up, he noticed 2 mice on the other side of the deck. They were a playful pair, chasing each other around in a circle. That must be the mouse version of Ring Around the Rosie, he thought to himself. The pair predominantly reminded him of his late wife and how he used to tell everyone he chased her until she caught him. A nostalgic tear came to his eye as he recalled walks they used to take at the park and how they'd often stop to watch the squirrels play or to feed the pigeons. They loved spending time like this together, just walking and talking. Although he wanted to ponder these melancholy thoughts, he couldn't help but be mesmerized by these 2 little creatures who were amusing him with their antics. First, they played for a while around the east side, and then ran under a bench on the west side of the deck where he lost them in the sun and harsh shadows. When they failed to reemerge for several minutes, he thought they left, but they soon returned. He was happy to see them again, which brought a smile to his wrinkled face. A third mouse appeared briefly, but the 2 just chased him away. This was their territory. Jill kept most of her gardening supplies around that part of the deck, so they must have found some stray seeds or something. They were going to keep this treasure for themselves and ward off any interlopers. Frank found watching them very relaxing and enjoyable. In fact, he couldn't remember when he had so much fun just sitting and watching something so natural. He sat there for nearly an hour before Jill came out of the house. "Hi, Dad, what you been up to?" "Oh, I've just been sitting here watching these 2 little mice running around the deck over there. They are a playful lot." Jill glanced in the direction he noted and said, "Really, Dad? When are you going to get the new glasses?" "Those are 2 dried leaves blowing."
spider on the deck.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Poor
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, I love that story, and I know, there were parts in it that I was like, but
Yeah.
I lost my husband last April.
Oh,
So,
okay.
I know, and it's
Yeah.
all around us.
Yeah.
It just doesn't go away.
No.
It's there. In my story, from Foxtales 8, is a story from my youth called Hot Summer Nights. As I lay here in my attic room, a thin sheet covering me, the whirring of the window fan is playing softly as it pulls the hot air out of the room. My bed is in the corner, tucked in the alcove, the lines of the roof on this old blonde bungalow. I shift a little to stick my feet out, as they tend to get hot under the covers. My pink-flowered cotton shorty pajamas keep me from getting too hot, but I like the comfort of the sheet upon my skin, just a hint of protection from a spider or mosquito that might be lingering. We played hard today after a quick breakfast of Cheerios with nice, cold, silky milk and a glass of orange juice, tart and pulpy. We did our chores, the morning dusting and sweeping down the stairs. Out to find a friend or two to hang around with, most days I played canasta on the front stoop with Susan Ozen. Last year it was Barbies, but we're older now, going into 7th grade. I have taken up reading novels that are 500 or more pages, stories like Exodus, Hawaii by Uris and Michener. One book will last me the whole summer. The next summer will be War and Peace. After lunch, we meet with some kids from the neighborhood and hike over to Grand Avenue. We're on our way to Reese Park to go swimming at the pool. We pass the telegraph towers by the American Telephone Company and walk past the brickyard with the hot fumes from the adobe ovens wafting into our faces. The sidewalk had ended and now it was a dirt path through some tall weeds that have grown next to the chain link fence like the ones that separate our yards. The line has already formed at the pool. We have another half hour before the gate opens and we go in. We are given a wire basket to put our clothes, towels, and shoes in, a key from the matron who stores our baskets on numbered shelves. The walk of death through the showers of cold water spraying in every direction. It was freezing in there, but no running is allowed. When we reach the pool, the din of the children and adults, the screaming and laughing was deafening. The water, if you can see it, is greenish and warm. I like to stand by the side and hang on, so if anyone pushes me, I won't get my face wet. After an hour, we have to get out of the pool and go back to the line and wait to get back in. If there are too many kids in the second group, we end up getting our basket, getting dressed, and going home. The hot summer days were like that, overcrowded. But after having been in the water, we were cooled off. So we walked home and had a snack of apples or cherries. Then we would get on our bikes and go for a ride or play another hand of canasta. After supper, there would be a baseball game at the corner. The four sewers at the corners were our bases. We used a softball and wooden bats, no baseball gloves except for the catcher. I played outfield and stood behind third base as it was the side by my house. I could always hit the ball when it was my turn to bat. As a lefty, I usually confused the pitcher and got a solid drive to center field. The group of kids were from a 2-block radius, and we all, of all ages, the oldest being a freshman in high school. We played until dark, never feeling the heat. We were too busy having fun. When the street lights came on and it was too dark to see the ball, we went our separate ways. My neighbors and I played tag or statue maker until the fireflies came out. We had our mason jars with pieces of wax paper with holes punched in, and once caught, we would watch them light up. There were so many fireflies back then in the city, they were crawling on our arms and legs. It was so easy to grab them. It was hot in the city in the summer. The lakefront was cooler, but we were 67 blocks west of it. The buildings, the asphalt, the tar roofs all made the heat more sweltering. But for some reason, we didn't feel it. There were trees in the yards and lining the parkways, the shade offering respite. At night, with the fireflies, the crickets, the buzz from the mosquitoes at the street lamps, we were too busy to feel it. The houses had window fans and screens. Doors stood open, letting in the air. By the time the sun went down, we could feel a breeze and savored it. We never complained because we didn't know anything else. When it rained and cooled off, everyone was lined up on their porches, watching the clouds roll in and feeling the wet drops spilling on their faces. Counting down the seconds between lightning and thunder, 1,000, 2,000, to see how far away the storm was. If there wasn't any wind, we would jump down the stairs and run around in it, cooling off. The water ran along the curbs and down the sewer drains that lined the streets. Summer storms were frequent, especially when it got hot. Summers in the city were always hot. Summer nights even hotter. Laying in my bed, just as I was feeling a little coolness coming from the fan, my grandmother would come up to her room, which is in the back of the attic. She would fuss around getting undressed and ready for bed. Then the fan would be turned off. Gran didn't like the sound of it, and she couldn't fall asleep with it on, so we had to endure the heat. My sheet would come completely off, and I would just lay there praying for sleep to take me. It always did. And in the morning, I was refreshed and ready to start another day. Hot summer nights, hot summer days. It was the best. Now I'm just going to do a little something that we have started in the Fox Valley storytelling group that is meeting on the fourth Sunday of every month at Oscar Swan Country Inn with a brunch at noon to 2 o'clock, and we're telling stories. So because John loved to tell stories, and being part of his group that he was with, I'm going to just tell a little story. This story is coming from a bird story that will be in Foxtales 9. And my story is about birds attacking me. When I was a little girl, I had birds attack me. Well, you think that's kind of weird. But yes, when I went to Aunt Jane's house for the first time for my parents to play cards in the basement, we walked into the door in the kitchen, and there was a parakeet flying around, flying right into me, and sitting on my shoulder. Well, I screamed and ran behind my dad, and that was it. We're not going into this house unless the bird is in its cage. And of course, to get to the playroom and the basement with the bar where we could sit up and have green rivers and cream sodas and play, you had a bowling machine and pinball machines, you had to go through the kitchen. So that was like, Nick, no, we're not doing that. Second time I got attacked by a bird was at Olson Rug Company at Diversey and Pulaski Avenues. And they had this beautiful waterfalls and a pond and ducks and geese. And of course, you could bring bread and you could feed the ducks and geese, but you were not supposed to put your hands through the fence. That was like, they had signs everywhere. Well, I did it. I had my piece of bread out behind, but the duck got me anyway. It snipped at my fingers. Screaming, I went and hid behind my dad's legs and said, no, that's it, I'm not feeding them anymore. When I was 10 years old, I already had these little attacks and thought, you know, I don't know if birds like me. Although I never had anything like a robin coming down and smacking me in the face in the yard. But when I was 10, the school group went to the zoo, and there was the aviary. Well, I can't remember which zoo it was, but we walked into the aviary, and I was like, I don't know. And my friends are going, oh, come on, come on. So I went in, and here's the birds are flying all over. They're free. And I thought, oh my God, birds. And the first thing that they did was they came and they took the sunglasses right off my head. Screaming, I ran out the door. They didn't touch anybody else in that whole class or anybody else in the room, me. So then that was it. I was not going into the aviary and didn't until my sons were little, and I said, I gotta go into the aviary with you guys. I don't want to, but. So then when I was 15, my family took a trip for 3 weeks out to California. We went to the Grand Canyon, through the Rocky Mountains, through the Great Salt Flats, spent time at Disneyland and in Los Angeles, came home the North Route through the Redwood Forest and Yellowstone Park and Cody, Wyoming, where they have the rodeos. So we're going to go to a rodeo. I mean, what are you going to do in Cody, Wyoming, but go to a rodeo? But you can't just go to a rodeo. You're Midwestern Hicks. We had to get hats, cowboy hats. And so we decided to go to the cowboy store, hat store. Walking in the door, this long vestibule and a door, and it was my mom and my dad, my grandmother, my little sister, who at that time was probably, well, she had to be 6 or 7, and me. In the transom above the door, as my father opens the door, a bat comes flying down and goes right into my hair. Screaming, once again, rush into the door, and the man who works there, grabbed the bat and was trying to untangle it, and I'm screaming, and he had to cut it out. And that was, fortunately, my last attack on my heart. But I have a story that will be included that talks all about birds and birding. And I am a birder, and I love birding now, and I love every kind of bird. So I overcame the attacks and my fear of it. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan, great job. Up next, we have Rick Waters, who is a former journalist who reported on general news as well as specialized news such as science, health, and politics. He writes in a variety of genres, including science fiction, mystery, and speculative fiction. Rick's work can be found in the horror anthology Familiar Spirits, edited by Donald J. Bingle, as well as several projects by the Fox Valley Writers Group, such as Foxtales 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, Phantasm's Door, Variegated Adventures, and Lauren Moore, just a couple. He's been around as long as I have, so that's all right. He also self-published a collection of 500-word flash fiction alternative history stories titled History's Left Turn. A fan of the sci-fi series Doctor Who, he regularly posts commentary on the show, television in general, and British culture through the lens of parody. Inspector Spacetime on his blog at inspectorspacetimerevisited.tumblr.com. Rick resides in Aurora, Illinois. Please welcome Rick Waters.
The story by John Westerly selected reminded me when I first saw the first draft, first thing I thought of was Back to the Future. I was a big fan of the trilogy, but there was one thing at the end of Back to the Future and became pretty prominent in part 2, was the flying car. So I wanted to read this in dedication to John. There is certainly no doubt that the zeitgeist of our youth is the most significant time of our lives. It's always been the basis for our view on life. Myself, a child of the 60s, my views were formed by the Beatles, the Summer of Love, and particularly technology. My adolescence consisted of space travel, computers, and transistorization. Science fiction was becoming reality. I used to eat up every word of the futurists in science and popular mechanics magazines, and in particular, the promise of someday having a flying car. It's been 50 frustrating years, and now I've reached the grand old age of 65. I've only one thing to say: where is my flying car? Oh, you must admit I've been patient. While silently following the molasses and January progress the industry has been making on my car. Oh, there have been plenty of upstarts like Gilo Industries with their Parajet Skyrunner, or Beyond Roads with their Maverick, and on. But these are all experimental craft that sell in excess of $100,000 or more, not production vehicles. Okay, to be honest, I've sometimes felt my hopes might just be a fantasy because of the one significant defect design defect in all our cars, the nut behind the wheel. Many drivers can barely operate their vehicles in 2 dimensions, let alone 3. To operate a flying car today, operators would be required to be certified pilots as well as drivers. But my friends, as Bob Dylan once said, the times they are a-changing. Think for a moment about the cell phone sitting in your pockets. A mere 10 years ago, all you could do was make phone calls and maybe send a text. 10 years before that, they had to be physically installed in your car. Now these wireless miracles are full-blown computers with GPS and apps of all kinds. See a trend here? The machines and functionalities of our daily existence are merging. Unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard of Google's driverless cars. Many of our cars have driver assist capabilities that help you watch out for traffic and will apply the brakes for you in case of an emergency. This technological convergence may soon allow us to see the flying car finally sailing over the horizon. If technology can relieve drivers of the responsibilities of operating their vehicles in a 2-dimensional environment, it's only a matter of time before the capability is expanded to the 3rd. We will then see a network of autonomous vehicles appearing in the skies over our heads. Just think about it. Everyone may soon have their own personal robotic chauffeur. Just get in the car and say, "Home, James." And when you wake up, you'll be home in your garage, safe and sound, and no more DUIs. So I ask again, where is my flying car? The story that I wrote that I'm presenting tonight comes out of Foxtales 7, and this is because spring training is already underway. It's about baseball. This is Up and Out. A long ride had brought Benjamin Jimenez to this point. From playing catch with his father in their small yard in the Dominican Republic to signing a letter of intent with Miami Marlins Fall League to getting traded to one of the St. Louis Cardinals farm teams. From there, he worked his way up on the back of his strong arm and throwing accuracy. That afternoon, Louisville Cardinals manager Neil Beckman had called Jimenez to his office. The meeting was short and to the point. The major league team needed a left-handed reliever and had called him up. Now, Jimenez stood on the visitors' bullpen mound inside Turner Field in Atlanta, hands resting on his knees as he took a breather. He'd broken a sweat with throwing warm-up pitches with backup catcher Miles Dornbach. A cell phone rang. The bullpen coach answered. There was hardly a word exchanged before he hung up and looked toward the left-hander. "Jimenez, time to go." The reliever tossed the practice ball underhand to Dornbach as 2 of his teammates opened the gates to the field. Time slowed down and the roar of the crowd seemed to quiet as Jimenez trotted onto the warning track. He felt a rush of adrenaline as he headed toward the mound where Cardinals manager Johnny Walker talked with the catcher and the infielders. Jimenez turned his head to take in the vast space of the ballpark and the huge throng of fans cheering and waving in the stands. It was almost overwhelming for him, this being his first time in a major league park during a game. On his way across the field, Jimenez saw there were runners on first and second. Atlanta's Carlos Perez stood in the on-deck circle, swinging a bat with a donut weight on it. He would be Jimenez's first challenge in the big leagues. The lefty was ready to take him on and prove himself to everyone in baseball. Everyone knew this was Jimenez's debut, but nobody made any mention of it. Despite his heightened state, he forced himself to calm down. As the practiced deep breaths countered the effect of the adrenaline, the crowd noise rose in his ears. 2 outs. We're up by 1, Walker said. All you need to do is get Perez out. Yes, sir, Jimenez said confidently. The manager patted him on his right shoulder. Pitcher Patrick Luck went over a few signs quickly. First baseman Mike Leach said he was ready for pickoffs, where Jimenez wanting to end the inning early. Then everyone jogged off the mound to take up their defensive positions. Jimenez tossed 3 pitches before Luck lifted his hand and verbally told the home plate umpire they were ready to resume play. The reliever took the set position, looked into Luck, who stuck 2 fingers down and twitched them toward the batter, a curve inside. The rookie nervously shook it off. He wasn't 100% sure he could throw a curveball where Perez wouldn't reach it. Luck gave the same signal again, but Jimenez shook his head again. He was sure that would be a bad idea. He didn't want his first pitch in the majors to be hit and possibly tie up the game. This time, the catcher threw down 1 finger pointing inside. Finally, the rookie nodded. He could handle that. Even though the catcher was the one calling the game, it was up to the pitcher to throw the ball. It was a modicum of power afforded him. Jimenez wound up, let loose one of his 98-mile-per-hour fireballs. Perez, anticipating this, started to swing his bat the moment the ball left the pitcher's hand. Wood approached rawhide for a seemingly interminable time. Jimenez's nerves jangled and his adrenaline kicked up a notch. As he finished his follow through and watched the pitch close in on the strike zone. Then there was a slap of baseball on catcher's mitt. Perez spun around in the batter's box, carried by the momentum of his swing. He barked something, probably a word of frustration at himself, the crowd groaned collectively following the miss. Luck tossed the ball back to Jimenez, who watched Perez scratch the dirt with his cleats. Then took a couple of swings just below the letters on the front of his uniform. That was his sweet spot where he'd do the most damage. Jimenez breathed in, held it, then let it out, trying to keep himself calm despite the stress he was under. I know what he wants. I'm not going to give it to him though, Jimenez told himself. The catcher flashed another sign, breaking ball, straight down the middle. Jimenez shook his head simply out of habit. Luck repeated the sign, and this time the rookie nodded. If he just threw it a bit high, Perez wouldn't be expecting it. He wound up and made the pitch. It came out faster than he'd expected, nearly 90 miles per hour, and the ball broke high. Luck reached up and had to get to his feet to catch the ball. It ended up well above the strike zone, which is where Luck had wanted it. Jimenez threw his arms straight out away from his body, an act of frustration. How could the ball have gotten that high? Had he held on to it a second too long? Why hadn't it curved down and headed directly for Luck's mitt? Jimenez reflexively licked his index and middle fingers, making sure there was no dirt on them so he'd have a better grip on the ball for the next pitch. The Cardinals catcher handed the game ball to the umpire, who dug a new one out of his pocket and tossed it to Luck. who pulled off his mask and jogged to the mound. Another mound visit that would count against the team, but if Jimenez got Perez out, it wouldn't matter. "Are you okay?" Locke asked, an edge of concern in his voice. Jimenez held his glove in front of his mouth. "Sorry, just not used to how loud it gets in these places." Locke nodded, smiled gamely. "It's always tough the first time out. You're doing fine. Just try to keep the ball down a little more." "Yeah, I will," the rookie replied, refusing to acknowledge the effect the crowd had on his concentration. "I'm fine, I can do these." "Good," Locke replied, then turned, put his mask back on, and returned to his place behind the plate. The catcher immediately called for a fastball on the inside. Jimenez didn't even think about it. His fastball was his out pitch. He nodded. He was ready for this. Perez dug in and swung the bat across the plate. Jimenez nervously checked the runners. Braves runner near first appeared to be a bit too far off the bag, so he threw the ball to Leach at first. The runner dove in, slapping a gloved hand on the base almost a second before the ball arrived in the first baseman's glove, which tagged him immediately afterward. The umpire waved him safe, and Leach returned the ball to Jimenez, who got frustrated that his throw hadn't gotten there soon enough. "Forget that," he chided himself. "Concentrate on Perez." Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Jimenez took another deep breath and repositioned his feet near the rubber, all while thinking about that previous pitch and how high it had gone. He didn't want to throw another one that far from the strike zone. The two runners took their leads again. Locke repeated the same sign as before. Jimenez nodded and went into his windup. He hesitated ever so slightly, trying to make sure that he was properly set to pitch. Then he let loose a 100-mile-per-hour flame. Perez's bat started moving before Jimenez even released the pitch. The ball started drifting toward the outside of the plate, which Jimenez realized only too late. And it wasn't breaking like it should have. That wasn't a good sign, and the relief pitcher knew it. Perez adjusted his approach, and his bat closed in on the fast oncoming ball. Closer, closer, then crack. Bat and ball met head on. Jimenez felt like he was moving in slow motion, and as he turned and watched the little white ball dot that flew into the air toward right field, he saw Trace Fields taking impossibly long strides, back, closing in on the warning track, leaping toward the blue wall topped with a yellow stripe, and colliding with the cushions as the ball continued over the wall just inches beyond his glove's reach. Time snapped back to normal, and the crowd roared louder than before as Perez trotted to first base and the other two runners crossed the plate in quick succession. Jimenez bent over, put his hands on his knees, breathing hard, as if he'd never get enough oxygen. Once Perez stepped on the plate and went to acknowledge the crowd, Locke accepted another ball from the ump and walked out to the mound. He placed a reassuring hand on the pitcher's back. "Not the end of the world," the catcher was saying. The pitcher stood up. He was grasping at words he couldn't catch and tried to say something. Nothing came out of his mouth. As he stood there, he spotted movement at the edge of the dugout. It was Walker. Locke apparently spotted him at the same time. "But this is the end of your night." He paused, then offered it offhandedly. "Good effort, though." Jimenez managed to look disdainfully at the team captain, rather upset at the man's choice of words. It was nothing like a good effort. He'd just given up the go-ahead run, on a home run no less. Pitcher resigned himself to his fate as the manager approached. It's not the end of the story. If you get Foxtales 7, you can read the rest of it. Thank you.
Got one more and we'll take a break, get some water, some dessert and everything. For those of you who came in late, welcome, glad you could make it. Next up is Rachel Bauer, who grew up in a small community of coastal California, feeding her hunger for words and stories as she looked up at the patches of sky just visible between the boughs of the redwoods. She majored in English and psychology at Knox College, and now lives in a small community of Elburn, Illinois, tucked amidst the whispering prairie grasses, accompanied by two furry, feline partners in crime named Sunny and Lisa. She writes short stories and a spattering of poetry about lucid dreams, sentient characters, modern-day myths, and not-so-distant worlds still awaiting discovery. Her work has previously appeared in Variegated Ventures, Lore and More, Foxtales 7, and Foxtales 8. Please help me welcome Rachel Bauer. Welcome.
So, I'm going to be reading a piece of John's too from Foxtales 7. He wrote so many beautiful stories, so many very moving stories, but I think this one was always one of my favorites. It really stood out to me. So. It's called An Old Woman Wondering. Lodged in front of a large stone fireplace, Mrs. Parris rested in her old rocking chair. As she rocked in the dim and flickering light of the fire, both the chair and the floorboards creaked in a pleasant harmonic rhythm. Together, they played a familiar and comforting nostalgic song. She sat in this chair on this night, as she'd done nearly every day for over 90 years, and on this evening she wondered, where did the time go? The oldest of 7 children, she remembered how she would often help her mother by rocking her younger siblings to sleep in the sturdy old rocker her grandfather built all those years ago. Later, as the children got older, they would enjoy sitting on her lap, gently moving back and forth as she read or sang to them. There were the times too when someone just needed a hug and a little comforting due to a scraped knee or a broken heart. That season of her life was followed by her doing the same with 6 children of her own, and still later with a multitude of grand and great-grandchildren that were given to her to love. Along the way, many wonderful and cherished memories accumulated in this chair. In addition, over the years, there were also the sad times, instances that would come along to pierce her loving heart, such as when a precious young one she had nurtured passed on. On this night, however, despite all her past endeavors and the love she had once shared, she found herself alone and longing for her days of giving and mothering. As the old woman's chair moved, gently powered by her foot, she happened to notice a small mouse on the floor. It remained very still in the dark, hoping not to be noticed. The little rodent was cautiously waiting near the fireplace until it was safe to proceed. No doubt another hungry pest seeking refuge from the snow and wintry weather outside, she thought. When she was a younger woman, she would have gotten up and grabbed her broom to kill or capture it, but tonight fatigue won out and sleep descended upon her instead. So as the fire that warmed the room slowly subsided, Mrs. Parris drifted into a dream. As she caught herself dozing off, she shook as one does when a chill comes on. Opening her eyes, she felt quite strange and suddenly realized she was no longer in her chair, but on the floor. She wondered if she had hit her head as everything seemed out of proportion. The grain of the wooden floorboards was much more rustic than she had remembered, and the stones of the fireplace looked enormous. Turning to look up, she was surprised to see the old rocker, now towering high above her. In it, she observed an old woman slumped over and sitting unusually still. She was even more shocked when she realized she was seeing all of this through the eyes of a little mouse. She then realized she was looking up at herself. Strangely enough, too, instead of panic, she found her heart to be peaceful and calm, although something deep inside did warn her to be a little fearful and very careful. Mrs. Parris soon discovered that the body of the mouse in which she now dwelt was that of a young female with a new brood of her own inside the wall. As she scurried across the floor, she was drawn to a small crack between two stones in the heart. Squeezing her little body through, she found her children awaiting her return. She had been away only shortly to gather nourishment for herself. During her excursion through the old house as a mouse, she recalled visiting the pantry where she found a few scraps of bread and some tasty cheese snacks. Cuddling up with her children, she was now ready to nurse them, and for the first time in a very long time, Mrs. Parris found fulfillment and was enjoying once again being surrounded by children. Feeling wonderfully content, she rested comfortably with them and fell asleep feeling the love she had so missed. Shortly thereafter, Mrs. Parris awoke and sat up in her rocker. It was noticeably colder in the room. She observed the dying embers of the fire and surmised she must have been asleep for quite a while. She reached for the poker she had next to the rocker and, using it as a cane, pushed herself out of the chair. She then poked and stirred the glowing fire embers a few times and tossed on 2 additional logs from the bin. As the fire started to come back to life, she began to recall her dream about being a mouse. Curious, she looked around the side of the hearth and found a small crack between 2 stones, something she hadn't been aware of before. In earnest, she began to wonder, was it really a dream? She then stood up and carted herself off to the kitchen. Upon her arrival, she went straight to the pantry. On the floor, she heard some breadcrumbs crunch beneath her feet, and on a shelf she found a bag of puffed cheese snacks. A small hole chewed into a corner of the bag was evident, and crumbs were everywhere. A tear came to her eye as she wondered, could my dream, is this all just a coincidence? She turned and focused her attention on the opposite side of the pantry. There she located the unsprung mousetrap she had set the previous evening. She carefully disarmed it and threw it into the trash before returning to her place by the fire. Upon returning to the fireplace and the comfort of her chair, she stopped only a moment to throw her old, moth-eaten shawl over her shoulders before sitting down. Then, with a smile on her face and a warm, compassionate feeling in her heart, she gently pushed off with her foot, closed her eyes, and peacefully departed this world. It was then that the little mouse reappeared, pulling itself through the crack in the fireplace stones for one last look at the old woman. So the one I'm going to be reading that has my stories today is from Foxtales 8, and it's called Equal and Opposite. You always said it was merely a question of balance. I kneel on the stage. When the red curtains part, the audience will find me in the center with my head turned to the stage left position. Soon, the music will cue with a tinkling piano. Once I could not have danced until I heard that sound or got a signal from you. Bella, let's begin. I don't respond because I've already started. I am slowly rising, 1 foot in arabesque behind me. Today there will be no music. Today, the stage is empty and silent. There is only me. You don't need music to practice, Bella, you urged me near the beginning. Use your experience. Employ what you've retained of the rhythm. Even in this silence, I can almost hear that tempo like a pulse. One knee bends so the leg outstretched behind rises a notch. My arm points towards the array of stage lights and the ceiling. The first time I assumed this exact position, you clapped and put your hands to your mouth. Experience suggested an array of possible reasons: wonder, fear, pleasure, uncertainty, satisfaction. It works. It works. You're doing it, Bella, you said. Those words told me the predominant feeling was most likely excitement and perhaps satisfaction. Remember what I told you before, Bella, your voice enjoins now. I've never forgotten a single word you've spoken to me. My feet shift, 5th position, pas de chat, point and rond de jambe, attitude with leg extended in front. I look from side to side, arms open facing the audience, as if I were enticing them. Those were your words, and I believe your intention throughout all of this. You've grown so much from where this started. Forward gallop, arms spread wide, leap. In the performance, the crowd will gasp. Their faces will look like yours in that first moment of success, but with something even more than I know how to define right now. Land in fifth, point and close, pirouette into fouette turns. My center of gravity is perfectly balanced. Momentum propels me in the tight turn. I could do this forever, but it's been too much. I can hear it in your voice. Fear mostly, maybe regret. My leg lowers. The servos squeak in protest, just a little. You always said you would get around to fixing that. I come to rest, arms cradled before my chest, vulnerable. My next steps are slow and sway in a way that you said would feel hesitant. They're afraid, Bella. The backers, the press, the rest of the public, no one was ready for this new development. You don't say my name the same. There's a longer space in the middle now. You say it Bella. Balance, experience, listening, and learning android. Sideways glide, pleating arms together toward the ceiling. A different attitude, with fingers bent to brush the floor while my back leg extends against gravity. This choreography isn't what you taught me to do. Now I add a half compass turn and swivel toward the audience. Rond de jambe with slow, sweeping turns of the leg, then up on my toes, high above everyone watching. I need you to consult your experience. I open the database as requested. I have done all you have asked of me. Review the finale for protocol. My mind whirs. Piqué turns in a half circle, descend to plie, an arabesque like at the beginning. The last is only to bow, one leg behind, then the other, sweep arms over chest, incline head. If there had been music, this is when it would cease. As it is, the silence remains unbroken. I don't want to stop. Continue the piqués for full circle instead. Come out into a dramatic fall forward, transition weight into an arabesque to the left, and not addressed toward the audience. Run finale protocol, Bella. The stage is so dark and empty. I feel weightless. Still, my mind follows the steps you've asked me to take. You huff out a sigh over the growing whir within my mind. I'm just sorry the balance part of the program never worked out. Who would have guessed? After all, natural movement was the challenge. It was envisioned that androids would master first. The public would have accepted that with excitement, given the potential functional applications of a bipedal model. You are talking to yourself, but you're right. The squeak in my leg was never fixed for a reason, after all. I saw how your expression changed in the split second after I struck that very first arabesque. The delight in your eyes faded, and your mouth fell open as I lost the center of gravity and tumbled to the floor with a clang. It was simpler to read you then. There was just one feeling: disappointment. And no matter how many practices, how many tries, that's how it always ended. Balance seemed to be beyond both of us. Let's focus on other things, you said then. The other letters. We did. Learning, listening to cues until they began to fit together in the experience database. Feeling on feeling, response on response, everything perfectly executed. There was just one aspect you never counted on, an addition of a new letter to my acronym. I for imagination. For a brief moment, I come back to myself as I really am. I can feel my body lying still on the table, legs locked, hands curled motionless. And yet, in my own mind, I am dancing, whirling free and easy on the stage where you said I'd someday make my demonstration of capabilities, wowing the audience, moving without limit or encumbrance. I even make the effort to delete the memory of that small servo squeak. A light flashes and quiet sound is made, like the cue to begin again or take center stage. Bella, your voice says, execute shutdown. It was always a question of balance. I've exceeded the bounds you set for me, gone beyond the limits that everyone in the audience would have been comfortable with, at least according to the emails and terse phone calls that left you running your hands through your hair. There is still time for one last lingering pirouette. Face the empty seats, smile. My lips move in a genuine, natural way. Now I can understand all the things that were in your voice when you first said it worked. Wonder, fear, pleasure, uncertainty, satisfaction. Now, I know how it feels to dance. One last move to execute and shut down sequence. Bow. The lights go, the stage fades, everything black and silent again. Click.
We will resume the second part of our reading today, and it's my pleasure to introduce Nick D. Markechevas. Nick is an old school weirdo in the traditions of Animaniacs, the Muppets, and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He creates unusual science fiction or unusual fiction through various means, including genre mashup, mad science, and the subtle alteration of reality by a secret benevolent means. If you're crying bullshit at this point, you've hit the truth square on the head. He also has an imaginary enemy instead of an imaginary friend, and you can find out more on his blog, theimaginaryplayground.com. Nick?
I left the imaginary enemy at home so everybody can relax. Yeah, he doesn't travel well. I've been telling stories forever. It's kind of like, we kind of have these conversations between people who don't exist or with people who don't exist, and somehow we don't end up in the hospital for it. So it's not a bad deal.
You get to write it down.
Yeah, that's what mostly I do. I feel like I transcribe a lot of conversations and sites and everything like that. I'm going to talk a little bit first about John. I figured I wanted to honor him with a speech a little bit. And it's not going to be as cool as his because I was never a Toastmaster and I didn't actually get into it. He always wanted me to come, but life kind of kept me from going for a while. I always said I would, and then, I suppose I still could, but I don't know if I'm going to because it wouldn't be the same without him, I don't think. I actually knew John from before Fox Valley Writers here. He worked with my wife at a company called Magnet Street up in Wheaton. Yeah, and I met him at a company party one time out in Deneda at the place when they still did these big fancy parties for this company and everything. I wasn't honestly sure I liked him at first, to be honest with you, because John's one of those people who's very direct and he's got a presence when he speaks with you and he's talkative. And let's be honest, most people don't always just automatically like jump into things and start like a whole conversation with strangers, but John did. And he and I talked about computers and technology and creativity and all sorts of things. But I was kind of like, okay, well, I met some guy that Margie works with, and so be it. About a year and a half later I'm in here, I'm doing this Fox Valley Writers thing. I think I was in charge of the group by then, but I'm not 100% sure anymore. But John walked in and I'm like, seriously, this guy? I didn't know about his creative endeavors. I thought he was a techie. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know he ever taught school. I didn't know he had been in the Navy. Nothing. All this came out from when we were his storytelling and his anecdotes in our writers group and everything. One thing he immediately did though was he was able to contribute immediately to just the meetings, the books, everything. He learned, he grew, he questioned all the time. And that went on every time I saw him. He never stopped trying to learn. And in that way, because I do a lot of that, he came to be my friend. We were both honest. We both worked hard at the craft we loved. We learned from each other. John was a great, great orator. He'd give a speech that would kick you to the curb if you tried to go up against him in some kind of competition. And hence, he was a great storyteller. I tended to model my oral tellings, things like that you're going to see me read today. I kind of modeled it on how he presented and things like that, and grew that way. And in turn, he strove for my kind of proficiency in telling the story on a page. It was a good synergy for us, between us and for all members of the group who knew him, which kind of, I suppose, goes without saying because we're all up here talking about him today. I did have the privilege, though, of watching him grow as a writer, year over year, book over book, and seeing how he developed. I made a point to tell him that when he took steps and when he grew, I could see it and recognize it, and I wanted to make sure he knew it because he worked at it. The things I'm going to miss most about John's stories are this weird characteristic of both the oral and the written storyteller that he presented more than anyone I've ever known. He made me question whether I was hearing a story or a first draft of a speech a lot of times. People who've been in the Fox Valley Writers with me for a while will know one of the first questions out of our mouths was always, all right, is this a speech draft or is this a story draft? Because he could meld the two really well. You know, he could tell a story, especially towards the end. He could bring that oral presence into a written story, and that's a rare thing. It's a very rare thing. Whenever I would question something and like that, like is it a story, is this a speech draft, he would take it as a challenge. He would go on with it and just take it home, and by the time I saw a next draft of it, whether it was written down or heard a next draft of it out loud, the story, they tended to reveal themselves, and they did so more and more as time went on. So in this book here, Foxtales 2, which was the first he contributed to, and then Foxtales 7, which was his last, you can see an uptick in this if you know what to look for, the melding of the story and the speech, and how they can both be important parts of whatever medium you're telling a story in. He took that big step as a writer, as an artist, call it whatever you will, a craftsman if you want. For me, being someone who likes to lead and teach and facilitate growth, I took that as a victory too. And that's the ways we tended to synergize with each other. And in light of all that, I'm going to read a peculiar story of John's that was the first one where I ever put it down after I read the draft and went, okay, what the hell? Is this a story or is this a speech? And in a way, it's kind of both, actually. And it freaked me out because none of this, despite how it sounds, is actually about a real person. It's called Puppy Love. He was one of America's most beloved poets in the mid-19th century, back in those early wistful days of America. He led a short and tragic life, but not before he made the hearts of young maidens swoon. Of course, I speak of Paul Ulrich Preston Love, otherwise known to his closest friends as Pup, or Puppy Love. What is it about a poet who can see things in the world and in ourselves that ordinary mortal men cannot even dream? Puppy had an incredible acumen for imparting beauty to his readers, male, female, young and old. His feelings were expressed in a style that was unlike any of his contemporaries and like no poet since. In his own unique bravado and antagonizing egotism, he attempted to expound upon the torture and ecstasy experienced in the heart of the versifier. Born in New Jersey, in a dirt hut not far from the Atlantic shore, he often whispered that it was from these muddy, humble beginnings that he developed his intrinsic love of the earth. Born into a family of vagabonds, little is known about his early childhood, except that his parents were poor, unsavory individuals who were often one step ahead of the law. Unfortunately, tragedy struck early for the young lad. When he was only 6 years old, he lost his whole family. One summer day, when he was off playing, his parents became aware that they urgently needed to make a quick exit from their home. They immediately headed for New York, but in their haste, they forgot to take him along. A tenacious child and wise beyond his years, he took it upon himself to find them, but not knowing in what direction to go, he just followed his nose, as he had an excellent sense of smell. He wandered for days before finally joining up with a band of gypsies who gave him food and let him ride their ass to Philadelphia. It was here he encountered a duo of roaming troubadours who, feeling pity for his plight, took him in and raised him as their own. They taught him to read, write, and the beauty of music. Thus, these times came to be known in his education as his education in the arts and letters. This time, This is the time when we also learn of his affair with the 3 young girls that inspired his insipid work, Young Infatuation. It was years later, at the age of 17, when returning home from a long romantic getaway, Puppy discovered he had once again lost his family. Tragically, in his absence, his loving adopted kindred had all died from eating mephitic mushrooms. Henceforth, he once again found himself orphaned, which permeated his soul with the desire to renew his quest of finding his original parents. Historians and biographers have long been astounded by the wondrous fortitude exhibited by Puppy to resume his path. They are oft quoted as saying, "Could this young man have pursued any higher calling?" He supported himself on his trek as a common laborer, toiling by day while loving and writing by night. Although most of his works were published posthumously, it was during this time he wrote his deepest and most inspirational work, the haunting and salacious Picking Cherries. It was about at the age of 21 and early into his manhood that Puppy contracted what was then called muscular catastrophe. Although his body was failing him, his organs and his mind were still firm and alert, as was his passion and his eroticism. It is said, when he finally succumbed to death's knock at the young and tender age of 27, it was with pen in hand, writing about passion he could no longer deliver. Obsessed with his own libido, Puppy Love wrote penetrating works expressed in such memorable verse as, "I come unto you and into you," leaving a legacy that will be forever precious in the heart of every passionate young lady. We always read drafts before we publish. We critique each other's drafts, okay? And so this comes to me in on a sheet of paper. It's in about 50, 60 sheets of paper from everybody's different work. I'm reading this at work. I'm a mailman, so I'm sitting in my truck reading this, and I'm going, what the hell am I reading? And so I go online, pull out my phone, try to look for this poet named Puppy Love. Can't find the damn thing. And I come back and I'm like, all right, that sounds like a speech, but this is bullshit, isn't it? And he's like, yeah. He's like, I made up this guy in this story. I just thought about Puppy Love, and this is what came out. And I'm like, you had me running around in circles, John. You just had me running. I have no idea what was going on.
Ah, serves you right.
Yep.
Now you know what we say when we read your stories.
I know. Most times people are looking at me like, ah. And to throw a monkey wrench into all of that, I'm going to read one of the more realistic ones that I have here. This started as a smart-ass joke, which I like smart-ass one-liners, so I kind of go that way. But then people like Rachel back there told me that maybe I should take a second look with a more serious eye, because there was a lot of kind of emotional gold to mine here in this story about an older couple, and well, you'll hear the rest in a second, and I'm glad I did. This is called Together. Don't try and talk me out of it, George. I've made up my mind, and you know how I am when I do that. George blinked thrice at 1 second intervals. Is this like when you finally decided to get rid of your furs? Maxine wriggled into an indignant posture where her shoulders got back and her nose went high. She commanded attention, even seated behind the wheel of a compact car. I had a revelation, she half whispered, like a cult preacher imparting secrets to her lunatic inner circle. An epiphany, in which, he interrupted, you sold your furs and bought that car you're sitting in. That's right! George sighed behind his bifocals and cloud gray goatee. That's not an epiphany, Maxie. That's keeping up. Maxine puckered sour. Go away. Don't call me Maxie. Not if I'm never going to see you again. Is that a double negative? No. No? Negative on the double negative. Now Maxine sighed. I hate it when you play with my words. George pursed his lips. I hate this. He held up a hand when Maxine opened her mouth. The threats, Maxie. The theatrics I can handle, but this... He shrugged. I think we should get you some help. Maxine scowled, too hard, like she'd been doing since he met her in 1972. Usually it made George grin, just like he'd been doing since 1972. But this time, it didn't puncture her armor. Instead, her chin rose another notch. A manicured hand moved from wheel to ignition button in an efficient flash of red lacquer. I'm serious. George closed his eyes and took a deliberate breath. I understand you think you are, dear, but you could really use a second thought on the matter. Maxine started shaking her head before he got halfway through his sentence. You think this is drama queen stuff? You think this is a whim? Nobody who's not serious gets in a car and rolls down all the windows and keeps the garage shut, George. She plucked a thin pink sheet of paper from the breast pocket of her shirt. See? I even wrote a note. Maxine. The uncommon use of her full name stalled her assault. What? I think something's really wrong, George said as gently as he could. Come on out and we'll talk about it, please? No! Maxine's hand wadded into a fist, crushing her note as she pounded the steering wheel. That's all you ever say anymore. That's all we ever do. Talk, and nothing changes. Well, I know what you're going to say, and I'm telling you, I'm not going back to see another one of those god-awful professionals again. She pounded again, beeping the horn. I'm sick of talking, I'm sick of nothing changing, and I'm sick of this life, and I swear to God, George, I'm really serious about this. He stared down at her with hands spread and mind empty of words. Although he'd never say so out loud, he sometimes thought of his wife's manic periods as a virus. There was no reasoning with her until it had run its course. Maxine looked up at him. She pushed that starter button. A soft whining sounded at the edge of hearing. She stared dragon's fire at George, the way she did when she was with strangers when she thought they were bluffing. It pissed him off and scared the hell out of him in equal measure. She'd never gone this far before. He leaned down through her creaky back and went eye to eye with his wife for maybe the dozenth time in 43 years. Maxine's eyebrows drew together, but George beat her to words. You're not killing yourself in that car, Maxie. It's an all-electric. Now you listen, you're sick and you're scaring me. Don't shut me out. Let me help you. He straightened up and opened the door. Please? Maxine's stare broke down in front of George's eyes. Her scowl faltered. Tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. She hung her head and made a miserable noise, but she also held out her hand. George took it gently. He helped her out of the car and kept his mouth shut. It wasn't the time for more words, not yet. Instead, he let Maxie inside, and their life went on, as always, together. We have one final reader today, and that's Dolores DeRoche, who was born and raised in Wisconsin, and after brief attempts at college and employment, followed her heart to Illinois, and for a few years later, followed her theater troupe to Batavia. She found her vocation in life, as well as a reason to go back to college at the public library, where she has been employed for 20 years. A relationship that has lasted longer than her first marriage. True love once again led her astray recently when she left Batavia and embarked upon her second marriage, but she is still at the library and active in the Fox Valley Writers Group. Under the name Dolores Witt Becker, her work has appeared in Foxtales 3, 4, 5, 6, Phantasm's Door, and Variegated Adventures, and in the ghost story anthology Familiar Spirits, edited by Donald J. Bingle and William Pack. All of these publications can be checked out from the library or purchased through Amazon. Please help me welcome Dolores DeRoche.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks everybody for coming. These are always a lot of fun, but sometimes it seems like we're just doing them for ourselves. So it's always nice to see plenty of people come out for them. I'm going to read a short piece that John did in Foxtales 5. I really loved John's outlook and his attitude, and I enjoyed all of his work. And it was kind of hard, picking something to read for this, but this one really kind of spoke to me. It's called On Aging. We watch the sun drop down below the horizon one more time as the calendar clicks off a digit and we find ourselves another day, another month, another year older. But getting old brings with it more than a few new wrinkles and age spots, additional aches and pains, and an ever-growing regimen of medications and protocols. However, these physical aspects pale next to the emotional changes we experience along the way. When we were children, time moved ever so slowly. School days were long, but so were summers. The longest span of time in our lives was the distance between our birthdays. Now the birthdays fly by, and time seems to be accelerating with every passing year. Grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles pass on, children grow and leave home, and we witness our grandchildren come into the world, only to grow up faster than we can spoil them. Speeding along, losing track of time, is now getting to be the norm. When was it again that we started to lose our hair, our hearing, our eyesight? Along with our restricted mobility and prowess, we also find ourselves the patriarchs and matriarchs of the family. Reality set in at the last funeral when we discovered we were the old folks now. Over the years, we were sad to watch as our childhood adult heroes and mentors passed away. Movie stars, sports legends, educators. Later, we experienced a very different emotion when our teen idols started to get old and then begin to leave us. Has anyone seen Shirley Temple, Davy Jones, or Patty Duke around lately? Then a new pain comes into our lives as we discover, with the passing of friends and other members of our own generation, that we are the survivors. So what's left for us to do other than fall asleep watching TV or sit around waiting for death to catch up? Well, if that's the way you feel, I'm not with you. For one thing, time has come to reap what we've sown, whatever there is of it. Now is the time to take stock of the relationships we developed throughout our lives, not fob them off. Today is for renewing and rebuilding those associations we've had with family, colleagues, and our neighbors around the world. We must also be cognizant, as long as we still have our mental faculties, that we've amassed a wealth of experiences, knowledge, and wisdom over the years that we can share, things that people have a right and a desire to hear. But just as important, there's a wealth of knowledge still waiting for us to learn and discover. Old dogs can still learn new tricks, as long as they aren't too lazy to try. Throughout history, there's been a plethora of so-called old people who have made significant differences in society. Some volunteer to help kids, take political stances, or contribute to the arts. You can expand your mind and go back to school, as did Mr. Chow Mu-hei of Taiwan, known to his classmates as Grandpa Chow. In 2006, he successfully completed his master's degree in philosophy. By the way, he was only 96 years old on graduation day. Then there's Anna Mae Robertson Moses, otherwise known as Grandma Moses. She was a renowned American folk artist who began painting at the age of 78. And of course, there are many more examples to motivate you. All it takes is a little initiative and a desire to feel alive. Want a place to start? Check out Toastmasters International, or find hundreds of other interest groups by connecting with websites like meetup.com. That's the thing about education and learning, it never ends. No matter the amount accumulated, as my father used to say about education, it's never a burden to carry around. So let's use it to stimulate our minds and to speak out, inspire and educate whoever will listen. We have skills that will atrophy without proper exercise, and although some have already become obsolete due to the pace of technology, we can still pursue our goals and desires until we return to stardust. We may be forgotten in 2 generations or so, but only if we allow it to happen. All it takes is a little effort to get out and be with people. Isn't it nice to think that the world will carry on for the better because we were once here? And I'm going to read a portion of my story in Variegated Adventures. It's called, the theme of Variegated Adventures, this was one of our in-between Foxtales books that usually have some kind of unifying theme. And this was a quest to discover the truth about a legend. So we sort of had some fun, much like with Lauren Moore, playing with folklore and legends and things like that. And my piece was called The Story of the Story of the Story. This spoon, Karen intoned, holding the utensil in question upright a foot or so in front of her face. Kevin chewed his bite of sandwich reverently and gazed at a viscous dribble that oozed from the soup-smeared bowl of Karen's spoon down the handle towards her fingers. This spoon, she repeated, once bore the life-giving broth of 10,000 chickens into the exquisite mouth of the celestial concubine of the 17th emperor. With his own hands he fed her, held her emaciated, sweaty, but still indescribably lovely head in his imperial lap, and through the power of his eternal love and the sacrifice of the 10,000 chickens, nursed her back from the very brink of death with this spoon. The way of the making of the broth of 10,000 chickens is lost to us, Kevin added with due solemnity. But let this spoon serve as a talisman that all may remember the power it once held to stave off death itself. The dribble of soup reached Karen's hand. She let the spoon tilt and fall horizontal, catching its bowl in the cupped palm of her other hand and lowering it reverentially back to the table before putting the besmirched fingers solemnly in her mouth. Time was Kevin would have made some wisecrack about helping her with that, a lame flirtation that barely masked his desperate wish to be in a position to say such things to her in smoldering earnest. She had once found his tacit adoration cute, and after that pathetic, and that had made her angry at herself, feeling that way about a guy who had been her friend since approximately kindergarten, and thus angry at him for inducing the feeling, unfair as she knew it had been. She had been somewhat messed up about it for a while and decided that the only way to handle it was to pretend it wasn't there. Kevin, bless his heart, had pretended not to notice her struggle, but had clearly absorbed her resolution, for lack of a better word. He instinctively respected her feelings without them ever having to actually discuss it in so many words. He really was a great guy. Kevin got up and cleared away the dishes. Yep, he said to himself, unaware that he was echoing what Karen had been thinking. What a great guy. Later, they would have reason to wonder if he had at some deep level been aware after all, but that was later. He carefully washed the spoon and set it aside to be put away with the other objects they had endowed with assorted invented juju in a game he thought of as Talisman of the Week. As far as he knew, Karen was unaware that he kept these objects in their own special place after the two of them had made up whatever bullshit legends had sprung to mind. Damn it, they were special, if for no other reason than that they represented what was, as far as he knew, the only activity that he and Karen shared with each other and no one else. It was their thing. He couldn't remember which one of them had started it, but they had been doing this on an irregular basis for weeks. He had quite a collection of random household objects that had been given new identities as magical artifacts. The first couple had been inspired by watching cheesy heroic fantasy movies while drunk, but over time it had crept into their everyday life, especially after Karen had broken up with the ding-dong she'd been living with, and Kevin had taken her in until she could figure out where she was going next. They might be eating lunch, as they had been today, or out for a walk, or doing housework, or even ignoring each other while they both worked on their laptops, and one or the other of them would suddenly seize a nearby object or flourish one already in hand and declaim its mystical provenance. She clearly wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that was fine with Kevin. Kev! Karen's voice was louder than was necessary to reach him in the kitchen. Yeah, I'm coming. Kevin! When she drew his name out like that, it was never a good sign. I think you'd better get in here and bring that spoon. The spoon? But Kevin heard the urgency in her voice, verging on panic, took up the implement in question, and hurried back to the living room. He found Karen curled up in the corner of the couch, as far away as possible from a trio of intruders, two of whom were massive enough to take up most of the rest of the room. They were, if Kevin were any judge of such things, two trolls flanking a goblin. Without conscious thought, he interposed himself between them and Karen and brandished the spoon, having forgotten that it was supposed to be a talisman of healing and restoration rather than a weapon of mighty puissance. Yes, thank you, said the goblin, lunging forward swiftly and plucking the spoon from Kevin's fingers before he could react. Your cooperation has been noted and appreciated. In light of the foregoing, and as this is your first notable infraction, you will be let off with a warning. Any further activities of this nature will result in more substantial consequences. Do you understand? No, Kevin and Karen bellowed at the same time. The goblin sighed and rolled its eyes. Is understanding necessary for your compliance? Yes, Karen replied less stridently, and was echoed by Kevin after a pause. Another sigh. Oh, very well. The way of the making of the broth of 10,000 chickens was not lost, but the spoon was. The spoon is required for the making of the broth to be efficacious. Thank you and good day. The goblin turned on its heel and continued to turn faster and faster until it vanished in a small green whirlwind. The trolls smiled rather alarmingly at Karen and Kevin, tipped their hats, and made as if to follow suit. Wait a sec, Kevin protested. You call that understanding? The trolls looked at each other, and one of them reached out and yanked the goblin back into the room out of thin air. What part didn't you understand? The goblin demanded. The spoon is needed in order to make the broth. You had the spoon, now we have it, and the broth can again be made. Where did I lose you? We just made that up. The spoon and the broth and all that, that spoon was part of a bundle of mismatched flatware that my aunt bought for me at a flea market 12 years ago when I got my first apartment. It's just a spoon. Are you telling me that some goddamn ancient magical spoon wound up in a flea market in Milwaukee? The goblin stared at Kevin over a pair of half-moon spectacles that it seemed to have acquired just for that purpose. The marketing of fleas and the walking of keys are not my concern. If you choose to meddle with forces you do not comprehend, that is also not my concern unless and until I am dispatched to collect such loose ends as this. Have I at last made the situation clear? Said Karen. What about all the others? Said Kevin, and realized a moment too late that it might not have been the smartest thing to say. What others? The goblin jumped on the question, showing the first sign of genuine interest in the exchange. Never mind, Karen said. There aren't any others. He's just a little wound up. At an almost imperceptible gesture from the goblin, one of the trolls reached out a massive arm, moving faster than should have been possible for a creature of that size, and laid hold of Kevin's shoulder and most of his chest. Kevin took several unwilling steps toward the goblin rather than be dragged by that implacable grip. What? Others? The goblin repeated, slowly and distinctly, once Kevin had been repositioned only inches away from his grotesque face. You know, just stuff. Just normal stuff that we just made up stories about. We just made this shit up. He started out almost mumbling, but finished up shouting in the goblin's face. Did you? The goblin cocked a prodigious eyebrow. It was just a game, Karen wailed. Just a game, the goblin repeated with a sneer. You people, you had no idea. Suddenly, he was seated at a tall scriptorium with a quill pen in one hand, poised over a scroll that curled extravagantly at both ends. Again, what others? Let's have them. No more shilly-shallying. He waved his downturned fingers at them in the universal gesture of dismissal. The troll released Kevin. Rubbing his shoulder, he went into the kitchen to fetch the collection. What else could he do? Karen followed him, glancing behind her as if expecting to be snatched back and held hostage against Kevin's return with the objects in question. Kevin, she hissed once they were both in the kitchen. What the murderous hell is this? You think I know any more than you do? He opened the cabinet he had been about to open when Karen had called him out of the kitchen and removed a wooden box about the size of a shoebox from behind the cleaning supplies. What's that? She asked, and then a moment later, you saved them? Kevin, it was just a silly game. Apparently not, he replied grimly. Yes, okay, I'm a gigantic dork, I saved them. So you knew they were important? No, I mean, yes, they were important, but I didn't think they were important to anyone but me. All right, well, what do we got? Instead of reacting to his confession, she opened the box and started poking through the articles collected therein, trying to remember what their goofy bullshit powers were supposed to be. A pencil that was some kind of spear, as she recalled. Several safety pins that, when linked together, formed an unbreakable manacles of immobility. A chipped teacup that, if held up to the ear like a seashell, would allow the listener to hear something. She couldn't remember what. A broken compact mirror, the various pieces of which would all show different places of the viewer's choosing. 3 mismatched chopsticks that could be used to define a trans-dimensional portal. Yes, these, just what we need. Karen grabbed the chopsticks, placed them on the floor in something resembling a triangle, grabbed Kevin's hand, and stepped into the space she had marked out. Nothing happened. Kevin looked at her in utter bafflement for a moment, then considered the chopsticks and made a small adjustment to one of them with his toe. A lavender whirlpool appeared in the space defined by the chopsticks, and Kevin and Karen were sucked out of the kitchen with a whoosh that almost masked the sound of the goblin shouting curses after them. And if you want to find out where they went and what happened next, tell Variegated Adventures.
You know, we forgot.